The last time I experienced sleep paralysis, it was disturbingly intense, for lack of a better word, almost demonic. I could sense and see the presence of three entities, one above me, one in the corner of the room, and one trying to unlock my bedroom door. I always make sure my door is locked while I sleep. The previous day, my sister had experienced something similar, and my mom mentioned she had heard strange noises from the room that week. That night was the last time it happened, and while it was less terrifying, it still left me shaken. I woke up and could feel the paralysis setting in. I tried desperately to move, shaking my leg to snap out of it. As I struggled, I felt the bed shaking violently, as if something or someone was trying to disturb me. After my first experience with sleep paralysis, I always sleep with my LED lights dimmed and never lie on my back, as it makes me feel vulnerable and more likely to experience it again. The first time was incredibly traumatic. In this episode, I was on my back and could only look straight up, seeing what was within my line of sight. I sleep near a window, and I noticed an overwhelming number of flies clustered around the curtains. The only time you see that many flies is when something is decaying or rotting. I was so confused, and I kept trying to wake myself up. The only thing I could do was mutter a prayer, hoping it would prevent things from escalating further. Then, I felt that same pressure on my chest, just like in previous episodes. But this time, I didn't see a demon right away. Towards the end, I saw an entity slowly creeping toward me, dressed in a white sweater and floral pants. The nightmare finally ended, and I woke up feeling disoriented and alarmed. However, the strangest part was that the flies, they were real. They were all over the curtains, and it terrified me. I immediately ran out of the room and grabbed some spray to get rid of them. Does anyone have an explanation for this? It was all so bizarre, and it seems that praying is the only thing that helps me escape these situations. I'm a 29-year-old woman living in an apartment on the sketchier side of town. I've grown used to strange occurrences and odd people showing up, but I'm also very cautious, especially after experiencing a home break-in in the past. That incident made me hypervigilant about protecting myself and my home. I'm also a smoker, and though it's a bad habit, I make a point of not smoking indoors because of my cats. I usually step out onto my balcony to smoke, which is exactly what I was doing the night this unsettling event took place. It started as a normal evening. I was sitting on my balcony, enjoying the quiet, when I noticed a car I didn't recognize pull into the back parking lot near my apartment. The lot is right by my balcony. I felt a little uneasy at first, but didn't want to overreact or seem paranoid, so I continued smoking and tried to ignore it. Then I heard footsteps coming from the backyard area. A large, burly man I'd never seen before was walking briskly through my yard. My anxiety rose, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was heading to a neighbor's place. However, as I watched, it became clear that he wasn't just passing through. He was heading straight toward my section of the backyard. That's when things took a chilling turn. He stopped directly below my balcony, looked up at me, and just stared without saying a word. My stomach dropped. In a panic, I blurted out, "Heck no," jumped up, slammed and locked my balcony door, and ran to my upstairs bathroom. Once inside, I locked the door, grabbed my phone, and called 911. While waiting for the police, I stood in the bathroom, straining to hear what was happening downstairs. It sounded like someone was fiddling with my back door, though I can't say for sure. I was in such a heightened state of fear that everything felt amplified. After several minutes, I cautiously peeked out of my balcony window. The man was walking back to his car. He got in and drove away. That gave me some relief, but it also raised more questions. If he had no intention of robbing me, then what was he planning? My gut told me it wasn't anything good. Thankfully, my flimsy doors and locks didn't get tested too much that night. Still, I can't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random drunk or high guy who had the wrong house. Whatever his intentions were, I hope to never see him or anyone like him again. If you're enjoying the stories so far, consider subscribing. It's free and you can always change your mind later. Now let's move on with the video. I grew up in Orange County, CA, but there were some pretty rugged areas nearby. One spot we frequented in high school was Black Star Canyon, located in the Cleveland National Forest. It's a vast, densely wooded area of oak trees stretching all the way from OC to San Diego, even nearing the border. It also happens to be home to Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton. Growing up, we had heard rumors that the place was haunted, and it turns out there was a tragic history there. Back in the 1800s, a tribe was massacred by hired trappers for stealing horses from Mexican ranchers to use for meat. Despite all that, my friends and I decided to hike through Black Star Canyon one night. We used to do adventurous things like this all the time, but I've always been pretty skeptical. Fortunately, most of us kept a level head. The area is also known for mountain lions, so we all agreed to turn back at the first sign of danger, even if just one of us felt uneasy. To get to the trail, we parked at a forestry gate and began walking along an old, narrow asphalt road that had mostly turned to dirt. This road had originally been used for horses back in the 50s or 60s until floods washed them out, and the land was later designated as National Forest Service property, eventually becoming a full hiking trail. Along the road, there was a stretch of barbed wire with several signs warning us not to cross. But there we were, wandering down a dark path under a barely visible sliver of moonlight well past midnight, without flashlights, just to add to the eeriness. As we ventured deeper, I kept noticing something out of the corner of my eye, a cowboy. He was leaning against a wooden fence post, holding the barbed wire, just watching us. He looked like a full-fledged cowboy, complete with a brimmed hat. But every time I glanced toward him, it was only a silhouette, barely visible in the dim light. Every time I looked directly at it, there was nothing there. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that I was overthinking it, and that it was probably just a trick of the eyes. But the figure kept appearing every 10 or so fence posts, and I kept it to myself, not saying anything to the others. After about an hour of walking, we reached a point where we began to discuss heading back because of the time. Then, out of nowhere, one of my friends casually mentions, "Yeah, I keep thinking I'm seeing a cowboy along the fence line." My stomach dropped. I couldn't believe it. These were just plain wooden fence posts, about 4 feet tall, with mostly empty fields behind them. There was no way any of those posts could look like a person. I finally spoke up about what I'd been seeing, and to my surprise, everyone agreed it was time to turn around. But as we started to head back, things got even weirder. Another friend suddenly started freaking out, ripping his shirt off and screaming that he'd been stung by something. We were all looking at him, confused, but he insisted a beat where something had stung him. We turned our flashlights on his back and were shocked to see 3 deep scratches running diagonally from one shoulder to the opposite hip, drawing blood. That was it for us. We were done. We made our way back to the car as fast as we could, but there were no further incidents. You could probably chalk up the cowboy sightings to dark shapes playing tricks on our eyes, but the scratches? That didn't feel like coincidence. Fair point. When you throw in the fact that we were all standing in a circle and watching as the scratches appeared out of nowhere, right as we were talking about this ghostly cowboy, it's hard to brush it off as a coincidence. There was no way he could have done that to himself, and none of us were near enough to make it happen. Something definitely felt off, like there was more going on than we could explain. What's interesting is that this same area made its way into Jack Osborne's show Haunted Highway during the pilot episode. It felt kind of surreal to see it featured, but also fitting considering all the weirdness that happened there. I've gone back since, but only during the day. I'm not quite ready to revisit it after dark. California definitely has a lot of hidden spots and strange stories like this one. This is just one of many experiences I've had out here. There's something about these places that leaves you questioning what's really going on. I would really appreciate it if someone could help me make sense of any of this. I've always been a skeptic, never truly believing in paranormal entities or anything of that sort, mainly because of the way I was raised. I was never encouraged to talk about anything like that, and if something strange happened, I would just shrug it off or try to find a logical explanation. But this was the start of a series of events in my home that I couldn't explain. This particular event occurred when I was 12, and it's so vivid in my memory that it feels like it happened just yesterday. It was a pretty normal day. My mom was in the study, my dad was in his room, and my brother was in his own room too. I left my brother to go grab some snacks for us. I always dreaded going into the kitchen because it was located behind the deck, and the deck was surrounded by windows with no blinds or curtains, completely exposed to the outside. I grabbed some random snacks and decided to sit at the table for a bit. I don't really know why, but I remember snacking on chips when, out of nowhere, I heard a knock. The knock was faint, but still noticeable. At first, I didn't think much of it because the roof of our deck was made from this plastic material, and birds often hopped around on it, creating the same kind of noise. So, I kept eating and didn't look up at all. Then, a second knock came, this time more firm, almost like an actual knock. But I still didn't think much of it and kept eating. I love food, if you couldn't tell. I didn't look up at that point either. It just kind of registered in my mind as, oh yeah, that sounded like a knock, which sounds pretty silly now, but at the time, it could have been anything to me. But then a third knock sounded, and that's when I finally looked up. And there, at the window facing me, was this extremely tall figure. It was levitating off the ground, obviously. It wore a dark black cloak with a hood, which was torn and kind of ripped. I couldn't make out its face. Maybe it didn't have one at all. It was just pure darkness where the face should have been. It looked... I don't know. I know it sounds cheesy, but it kind of looked like the Grim Reaper in a way. I was terrified, frozen in place. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, and in the blink of an eye, it just vanished. I sprinted to my mom and tried to tell her about it. She was a bit concerned because I'd never been the type to have an overactive imagination or talk about these kinds of things. But she just brushed it off, saying it was probably due to not getting enough sleep. I don't know, maybe she was right, but I'm really not sure. It felt so real to me. I even tried to show her visually what I had seen, but it seemed like she didn't believe me. I didn't even try telling my dad or brothers because if my mom didn't believe me, I figured they wouldn't either. But I know what I saw that day. And the fact that it happened in broad daylight makes it even more unsettling. I had always thought paranormal events were more likely to happen at night or in dark hours, right? And the fact that more strange things happened after that, possibly connected to it, just makes me feel uneasy, though I still don't really know what to make of it. I'm glad to hear that you moved out of that house and that the strange feeling you had lifted. If anyone has any insight or explanations on these types of experiences, I'm sure they'd be willing to share. I can imagine how unsettling it must have been, especially with the eerie feeling it left behind. If anything, sharing your experience could help others who've gone through similar things or shed light on something that might be going on. I hope you find the answers you're looking for, and if not, I hope you can at least find peace with it. My cat has a habit of going outside every morning. He follows us to the door, takes the elevator down with us, and spends his day outside until we bring him back home in the evening. He's not exactly the most punctual, so it's common for him to stay out longer than expected, sometimes even for several days, or other times, he gets bored after a couple of hours and wants to head back inside. The issue is that when we're not home, he's left to wait. Since we live on the first floor, his solution is to sit under one of the balconies and meow loudly to get our attention. When we're home, this works fine. But when we're not around, it's much less effective. So, our solution has been to ask the neighbors who have a key to our apartment to bring him back inside. Neighbors who don't have the key sometimes let him inside the building to keep him from being outside, especially if it's raining. Our apartment is a bit different because it's bigger than the others. To enter, there are two options once you're in the main hall. One involves using the stairs on the left and opening a door with two locks. The other takes the elevator with a special key that leads directly to our apartment, where the door only has one lock. My cat and I are both used to the second option because it's more convenient. However, when the neighbors who don't have the key let him inside the building, he ends up going up the stairs and waiting. Since I usually use the elevator from the parking garage 2 floors below, I don't often see my cat waiting in the hall. He'll meow outside the door, waiting for one of us, me, my dad, or my mom, to open it for him. All in all, we've settled into a routine that works well with my parents, neighbors, and me. Now that you have a sense of how things go with the little guy, here's where the story takes a turn. My parents love the outdoors, so I'm usually on my own over the weekends. It typically means doing chores and inviting friends over so we can enjoy the apartment without interruptions, which is nice. On this particular evening, I was alone. It was around 11 p.m., and I was just relaxing in the living room when I heard meowing over the sound of the TV. Someone must have let my cat inside the building, and he was waiting outside the door as usual. I grabbed my keys and began unlocking the door. As a pet owner, you get to know your pet's sounds, and I could recognize my cat's meow from a mile away. His meow is high-pitched and rises in a certain rhythm, something I've heard nearly every day for the past 5 years. But as I was unlocking the door, I paused. The meowing sounded different, deeper and slightly off. It wasn't the usual tone of my cat. And here's the strange part. My cat is the only one who knows to wait by the door and meow loudly to be let in. By that point, I had stopped halfway through opening the door and waited, listening to see if I hear my cat again. This time, I noticed scratching sounds, but my cat never scratches at the door. That was when I started feeling uneasy, but the meowing was getting louder, and I didn't want to disturb the neighbors. So, I kept going with unlocking the door, but then I heard another noise that really freaked me out. It was a cough. For context, I'm not usually a cautious person. In my 21 years living in this apartment, I probably checked the peephole no more than 5 times. But something in the back of my mind urged me to do it that night, and I'm so glad I listened. I let go of my keys, put my eye to the peephole, and saw him, a man standing outside my door, meowing. I can't even describe the level of terror I felt in that moment. My heart nearly stopped, and I just froze. I'm not sure how long I stood there in shock, but eventually, my instincts kicked in. I did what anyone would do in that situation. I ran to grab my phone, hid in the corner of the living room, and called the police. By the time they arrived, the man was gone, and there was no sign of him outside my door. I can't even remember when the meowing stopped. The police took my statement and advised me to be cautious, then left. To this day, I have no idea what that strange man wanted, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to know. I also can't figure out how he managed to get into the building in the first place, since you need a key to access it. How did he know I'd open the door if he mimicked my cat's meow? Well, at least I'll be extra careful from now on, I guess. And on a lighter note, my cat eventually returned and is now peacefully sleeping in my bed as I write this. So there's that, I suppose. I've always been a skeptic. I don't really believe in paranormal things, but I'll admit, I'd probably refuse to be alone in a haunted place, and I do get uneasy around ghost-related stuff. There's one particular experience from my childhood that I remember vividly, but I have no explanation for it. I'd like to get some opinions on what it might have been, especially from those with a more paranormal perspective. I grew up in a council estate in northwest England in a pretty rough area. I believe it was built on the site of a small Italian POW camp after World War II, though I'm not entirely sure. There were always rumors and local stories about haunted pubs in the area. My mom was always watching paranormal shows like Most Haunted, so I was brought up with that mindset, where everything was easily attributed to ghosts or unexplained phenomena. I remember hearing stories about a black shadow moving through our terrace, which was something neighbors often talked about. But it's possible that was just a tall tale. So here's what happened. I was probably around 11 or 12 when this took place. I'm 25 now. One day, my parents and younger sister went out for a school performance, and I was left home alone. Or at least, I thought I was. But then I heard some noise downstairs. I went to check it out, but when I got there, there was nobody around. I thought it might have been my oldest sister who was home, but when I checked, I realized she was at a party. Then, I heard footsteps coming from upstairs. So, I stepped outside to check my parents' bedroom window, and I saw that the light was on, which seemed strange because I was sure I had turned it off myself when they left. I thought my sister might have come back, so I went back inside, locked the door, and went upstairs to check things out. I looked around upstairs, but there was no one there. No one hiding anywhere either. I turned the light off again, but as soon as I did, I heard a loud crash coming from the kitchen downstairs. I ran down to see what happened and found a plate on the floor, smashed, along with all the cupboard doors wide open. The cupboard where the plates were kept was on the left, raised above the counter, and from what I could tell, only one plate was broken. But I was so terrified at that point that I didn't dare stick around to see what else had happened. I decided to head next door and stay with them until my parents got home, which was about an hour later. They didn't really believe me, which was kind of disappointing. I know for sure I was alone in the house at the time, and I still can't figure out what could have caused it. There were a few other strange things that happened in that house, but we also lived in the house 2 doors down, which had even more bizarre stories according to my mom. Strange occurrences like shadowy figures, lights flickering on and off, and, occasionally, things seemingly moving on their own. However, this incident was by far the strangest thing that happened to me. From a paranormal perspective, what could it have been? I'm not sure if I fully believe in such things, but I'm definitely curious and open to learning more, hoping to find some sort of explanation for what happened. I think it's always good to stay open-minded about things like this. This happened maybe 6 or 7 years ago, and I still have photos on my camera from the time, though I haven't updated it in ages since I gave up on photography. I hope you can trust me on this. We've been going on these family trips for a long time, probably 17 years if I had to guess. I won't say exactly where we go, but it's in the Australian bush, just to give you an idea of the setting. We've had a few creepy experiences there, but nothing that couldn't be explained except for this one event. It still weirds me out, and I can't think of anything that would explain it. So, the year this happened, my sister, cousin, dad, and I all drove up together and were the first to arrive at the house. We had to wait for my grandma to arrive with the key, so my dad sat on the deck with a beer while my sister, cousin, and I went on a little adventure. The three of us made our way to a small creek not far from the house, which we had nicknamed Bride to Terabithia because of a fallen tree we used as a bridge to cross. The creek didn't usually have water in it, and it wasn't deep or wide. We could easily walk through it. The tree was just fun to use. Anyway, as we were walking across, my cousin made a sarcastic comment asking, "Is there something dead around here?" It was because of the huge number of flies around. Sure enough, when we reached the other side, we came across something dead. It was a kangaroo. Nothing too shocking, since I'd seen plenty by the side of the road before. But this one was different. It was cut clean in half. And when I say clean, I mean perfectly halved, almost like it had been done surgically. There wasn't a single drop of blood on the fur or the ground, and the top half was completely gone. I had my camera with me, so I took a few photos. Then my cousin poked it with a stick, and suddenly, hundreds of flies burst out of it. My cousin and sister kept poking at it, trying to move it into the creek, but even half of a full-grown kangaroo is pretty heavy. Their sticks eventually broke, so I grabbed the tail and dragged it into the creek to bury it. We didn't really bury it, just covered it with sticks and flowers. We searched the area thoroughly for the top half or any trace of what had happened, but we couldn't find anything. We decided to go back into the creek, walking through it in search of something else, and what we found only deepened the confusion. If I remember correctly, there were 4 dead rabbits, but only their bottom halves, all neatly arranged along the creek floor, stretching to a thick brush where we couldn't continue. The same oddity applied to these rabbits, no top halves to be found, and there wasn't a trace of blood anywhere. They were also cut clean in half, almost as if it had been done surgically. At that point, things had gotten too strange, so we decided to leave. We didn't go back to that area for the rest of the trip. However, we've returned to that spot every year since, and we've never seen anything like that again. I've lived in the same house for 18 years in an old coal mining town in Pennsylvania, and over time, things have only gotten worse. I know my house is haunted, but something far more unsettling seems to be stalking my family. The first strange experience I had was in the early 2010s. I was walking home when I heard my name being called from a distance, and it sounded like my friend. As I walked toward the house, I had a feeling I was being watched. When I turned around, I saw a dark humanoid figure, at least 7 or 8 feet tall. The moment I laid eyes on it, I ran home. Things were relatively calm after that, but in the last few years, things have escalated. It started with rustling sounds in the woods and the persistent feeling of being watched. Then came the deer, so many of them. There was one in particular that I kept seeing in the same spot for several days on my way home. It didn't look right, and something about it unsettled me. The most recent events have pushed me to look for answers. 2 nights ago, my mom saw a pale white face with glowing eyes pressed against the front door. She froze in fear, unsure of what to do. Tonight, after getting home after dark, I walked toward my house. As soon as I locked my car, I heard a blood-curdling scream from the direction of the train tracks, followed by a calm voice calling out help me very loudly. I froze for a solid 15 seconds, just listening. Slowly, I walked up the porch steps, hearing two distinct voices. One was frantic and screeching, and the other was calm, calling for help. I yelled for my mom because the frantic voice sounded like my younger sister, but I wasn't sure if she was messing around. When she came outside, it grew quiet, and the frantic voice stopped. We heard help me one or two more times, but faintly, and then nothing. My sister was at a friend's house, so it couldn't have been her. Later, when we went to pick up dinner, we noticed there were deer everywhere again. While it's not unusual to see a lot of deer in Pennsylvania, these ones were different. They stared at us without running, even if they were right in the middle of the road. Now, I'm just trying to understand what's going on. What are these things? What's happening around us? I don't know what to make of it, but it's terrifying. To summarize, ever since I moved into my apartment complex 3 years ago, I've been dealing with strange paranormal experiences that I've come to call Bill. I know it sounds silly, but giving it a name makes it less terrifying. In the first few months, I started hearing someone breathing behind me at night, whether in bed or in the bathroom. I also noticed tall figures in the hallway or in my dad's room. I live with him. The odd occurrences seem to follow me, too. During my time here, I've been to 2 different psych wards for unrelated personal reasons, and, strangely, I had paranormal experiences there as well. I wasn't admitted for mental health reasons, just visiting for other business, but while I was there, I saw tall figures in the hallways or moving past windows. One night, a patient I knew saw a tall figure on the roof while getting medicine. I also had the sensation of being watched or feeling as though something was about to pounce on me in my room. And Bill is still with me, even after I left the psych ward. At home, while I'm alone, I hear knocking and scratching on the walls, and I often feel like something is going to jump at me from behind. Random items, like water bottles, disappear overnight. Other strange things, like faucets turning on by themselves, have been happening, though I find them more annoying than frightening, especially with the water bins. I've also been touched in odd places, like on my arms and legs, and even had a sensation of a head resting against my side last night. I know this might sound ridiculous, especially since I gave it a name, but I could really use some advice. I talked to a friend who's more knowledgeable about spiritual matters, and they believe I'm dealing with a nuisance demon. I wanted to get some outsider perspectives to see if there are other possible explanations for all of this. When I was 16, something happened that has stayed with me all these years. I was playing the original Paper Mario one afternoon after school, and while I was absorbed in the game, I heard my mother call me from downstairs. I paused the game and responded, "Yeah, what's up?" She called back, "Come down to the office, please. I need help with something." "Okay, I'll be right there," I said, trying to be the helpful son. I went downstairs to the office, but when I got there, it was empty. Feeling confused, I checked the kitchen, my mother's bedroom, and all the usual places she'd be. I even went to the garage and noticed her car wasn't there. Finally, I went to the living room and found my father reading the paper. I asked him where Mom was, and he told me she wasn't even home yet. I stood there, trying to process everything, and my dad noticed my confusion. He asked what was wrong, and I told him that I definitely heard Mom calling me for help in the office. He just shrugged and went back to reading his paper, not offering any explanation. So, to this day, I can't explain it. Something, in my mother's voice, called me to the office when she wasn't even home. It's something that still confounds me. I've been feeling a lot of stress lately, especially as my mind keeps wandering back to something that happened last winter. I'm no stranger to hearing or seeing things, but I usually keep it to myself because there's always that uncertainty. What if I imagined it? But this time, it's been bothering me, so I'll share what happened. I live in Texas, and at the time, I was in a house that didn't have central cooling, so the temperature inside was usually the same as it was outside, or close to it. During that winter, it was freezing outside. In the weeks leading up to one particular day, I kept hearing what sounded like someone calling my name. It would happen while I was alone in the house, and while it was subtle, I just assumed I was hearing things. My parents had gone to the store that day, and I felt a little uneasy being alone, but I shrugged it off. I thought, what's the worst that could happen? I'll hear my name, check around, and nothing will be there. Simple, right? So, they left, and the house was extremely cold that day. I wrapped myself in a blanket on the recliner, wearing pajamas and a sweater, trying to get comfortable. I was starting to feel sleepy when, out of nowhere, I heard a man's voice calling my name. That was it. I decided I had to check things out. I stood up, walked around the house. It was daylight outside, and it was snowing, too. As expected, there was nothing. But then I had this thought, how could I relax again knowing that I'd hear something as soon as I did? We've all seen those movies where someone lets their guard down, only to regret it, right? So, I made a deal with myself. I would record myself sleeping. If nothing happened, I'd just fall asleep and nothing would be the wiser. If something did happen, I'd have proof to show my parents that I wasn't crazy. Sadly, the outcome was not what I hoped for. I placed my phone on a table near the recliner, set it to record, and tried to relax. I thought maybe I could drift off to sleep with the recording going. I woke up about half an hour to an hour later to the sound of a woman crying. I was still a little drowsy, but I could hear it clearly. I looked around, trying to locate the source of the noise. Then I realized it was coming from a small hole near the recliner. I know it sounds strange, but the floorboard hadn't been installed correctly by the previous owner, and it eventually broke. We put a temporary board over the gap, but it left a small hole that didn't fit perfectly. The crying was coming from that direction. I stared at it in disbelief before jumping up in shock, and the sound faded away. For a moment, I wondered if I had just woken up from a lingering dream or if I was just imagining things. But the only way to know for sure was to check the recording. I grabbed my phone, paused the recording, and put in my headphones, my mind racing with thoughts. I thought to myself, 1, maybe I'll hear nothing and laugh off my paranoia, or 2, I'll hear the sound and confirm the awful truth. I went outside after that because I didn't feel comfortable staying inside anymore. The temperature was about 20 degrees Fahrenheit. I know that might not sound too cold to some people, but in Texas, where it usually gets up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit or higher, it felt freezing. During the winter, power outages were frequent across Texas since they weren't prepared for snowy weather. I ended up sitting on the porch, headphones on, fast-forwarding through the video until I saw myself wake up. I rewound a few minutes before to see what I had missed. My heart raced as I watched it. In the video, I was sleeping normally, but then something strange happened. There was an eerie whine in the audio, growing louder until it distorted, cutting in and out. In the video, I woke up, glanced around sleepily, and then looked at the floor before suddenly jumping up in shock. I was overcome with chills and stayed outside in the freezing cold until my parents came home. I didn't want to go back inside. What I did next might seem strange, but I'll explain. I've been through a lot in life, near-death experiences, poverty, and an abusive father, along with the terminal illness of my mother. My stepfather has been the one there for me. Back then, I wasn't easily scared. I believed it was best to face my fears, so after some time, I calmed myself and went back inside. I went to the living room where it happened and closed my eyes. My brother passed away when I was a teenager, and when I'm struggling, I speak to him as if he's still around. I said, "Brother, I don't know what to do. I'm hearing things, and it's weighing on my mind. I can't relax, not even during the day. Now I have proof that it's not just in my head. I love you, and I miss you, but I'm going to keep trying." I felt some relief after that and started saying a prayer. I'm Christian, but I'm not always sure of everything that comes with religion. I'm not certain about who or what God is, or about the right way to pray. But I prayed, pouring my heart out, hoping that God would understand my confusion and guide me. I said, "Please give me guidance. I understand death is a part of life, but I don't know how it works." The crying I heard sounded like a woman in pain, and I was scared at first. But all I can do now is pray, not for my own fear, but to show whatever this is love and guidance. Let it come into the light and end its suffering. I took a deep breath after finishing the prayer and opened my eyes. I didn't feel scared anymore. My heart felt at peace. I realized that fear often comes from not understanding something. I had thought of the crying and instantly connected it to ghosts, scary movies, or death. But I hadn't considered how it might feel to be trapped in a dark place, stuck in a house, alone, whether a family member, friend, or even a stranger. Now, as I write this, I don't feel stressed anymore. I showed my parents the video, and of course, they were frightened and unsure how to feel about it. In the end, I decided to move on from it all. I realized it's better to accept what happened and continue forward with life. There's just too much about it we can't fully understand. I'm relieved to finally share this, and whether anyone believes it or not is up to them. But I'm grateful to have been able to get this off my chest. Now, I can finally get some sleep. Thank you for listening. I live in Florida, and this event took place about 3 weeks after Hurricane Irma, not long ago. Back in July, my ex and I had just finalized our divorce, and I moved into a gated community. All the houses were rented by the same landlords or rental company, and it was a small neighborhood, just around 15 homes. All of them surrounded a man-made lake, with the backyards facing it. None of the properties had fenced yards. When you stepped out of the back door, the lake was right in front, with your neighbors' backyards to either side. The community was quite close-knit, with someone always hosting a family gathering or barbecue, or getting people together to watch sports. I was still struggling with my divorce, so I avoided those social events. The only neighbor I really got to know was Steve, who lived next door. He was an active Navy soldier with a strong passion for guns. Steve turned out to be the real hero of this unsettling experience. My daughter, Alice, is 4 years old, and I get her every weekend. Her bedroom window faces the lake, and I spoil her endlessly. She's my everything, and I count down the days until the weekend to be with her. So, when Hurricane Irma hit, I was devastated that I couldn't see her for almost 3 weekends in a row. The weekend before the storm, she was with her mom. Then, of course, she stayed with her mom during the storm itself. The weekend after, she still couldn't stay with me because the power was still out at my place. No air conditioning in Florida heat is unbearable. The humidity was so intense that week that I ended up sleeping in Alice's room the entire time. It's the only room with a window that faces the lake. I opened the window and kept the screen up to let the breeze cool the room as much as possible. Eventually, the power was restored, and Alice started coming to visit me again like normal, but that's when the nightmares began. Alice started talking about a singing lady and how she didn't like her anymore. At first, I thought she was referring to one of my ex's friends or perhaps a teacher at her school, maybe someone she didn't get along with. But then, one Saturday night, Alice woke up in the middle of the night, screaming in a way I'd never heard before. I rushed into her room and turned on the light, finding her hiding under the covers. When I asked what was wrong, she only pointed to an empty corner of the room and said, "Look, look," but there was nothing there. She acted as though she had seen a ghost. After I managed to calm Alice down, she started talking about the singing lady again. "Please tell the singing lady not to come back. Please, Daddy, make her go away," she begged. Naturally, I assumed she was just having a nightmare. Right? I checked under the bed and in the closet, reassuring her that there was nothing to be afraid of. She eventually calmed down and went back to sleep. I went back to my room and quickly fell asleep as well. But it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes when Alice burst into my room, screaming, "She's back! She's back!" Alice refused to go back to her room, so I let her sleep with me that night. The next morning, we went out for breakfast, and I took her to Target to pick up a baby monitor. I hadn't used one since my ex and I were married, but I wanted to make sure I could hear her if these nightmares happened again so I could respond right away. After setting it up, I showed Alice how it worked to reassure her that she was safe. That night, she slept peacefully. For a few nights, everything was quiet. Then, the following weekend, Alice had to stay with her mom because she caught a stomach virus from a friend at school. It was Saturday night, and I was sound asleep in my bed when I suddenly heard a woman's voice humming a soft nursery rhyme through the baby monitor. The humming and soft singing grew louder and clearer as the voice got closer to the monitor. I wasn't dreaming. I was wide awake, and I could clearly hear a woman singing lullabies in my daughter's bedroom. My heart raced with a mixture of terror and disbelief. Then the voice spoke. "Alice, sweetie, are you awake?" Pure adrenaline coursed through my veins. I jumped out of bed, locked my bedroom door, grabbed my phone, and called Steve from next door. He didn't waste any time either. After I got off the phone with Steve, I heard him storm out of his back door, shouting, "Don't you move!" I rushed outside and found him pointing his shotgun at a woman crouched outside my daughter's window, the same window I had left open after Irma and had never closed. Steve quickly lowered his weapon when he recognized her. It was Jean, the neighborhood maintenance woman. Steve's wife came rushing out and confirmed it was indeed Jean. Jean tried to play it off, claiming she hadn't been singing and didn't even know my daughter's name. She said she was near the window because she was doing her usual patrol for gators, thinking one might have approached our house from the lake. But I knew she was lying. She had been singing and had called out my daughter's name. Sure, there had been a few gator sightings around the neighborhood, and yes, part of Jean's job was to patrol the lake at night, but at 2 a.m.? That didn't make sense. I could tell from Steve and his wife's expressions that they didn't buy her excuse either. The next morning, I went to Steve's house to thank him and explain everything that had happened. He told me that Jean and her husband were known to be a little off, but this was by far the strangest thing to happen. Steve, the hero, then helped me install metal bars on Alice's window that afternoon. I drove out to my grandpa's barn the other night to grab my brother's wallet, which he had left there by accident. It was around 9 p.m. While I was getting the wallet, I suddenly felt like I was being watched. Let me give you a bit of background. About a mile from my house to the barn, there's a culvert right before a large hill with a curve halfway through. You have to slow down to avoid a potential accident. So, I slowed down to a crawl on this back road, and when I did, I saw two kids standing in the road. I try to be a good-natured person, so I stopped to see what they were up to and if they needed help. Growing up, I had heard stories about strange things happening on this road, ghost lights, and even a woman who asks for a ride and screams if you say yes before disappearing. But this felt different. I stopped and asked if they were okay. I figured maybe they had been out riding four-wheelers or something and had gotten into trouble. One of the kids asked for a ride, but his voice sounded off, too calm, and he wouldn't make eye contact. I glanced at the other kid. I live in the deep south, where the mosquitoes practically swarm, but this kid was completely covered in them. He didn't even swat them away. So, I asked him, "Why are you looking down like that, man?" He finally looked up at me, and I swear, his eyes were as black as coal. I hit the gas as hard as I could, zooming up the hill, barely making the curve. Both of them just stared at me as I sped away, kicking up gravel and dust. I got out of there as fast as I could, and let me tell you, I didn't sleep well that night. When I was in high school, I lived in an apartment complex in Calabasas, California. It was where most of the kids who weren't incredibly wealthy, but still went to Calabasas High School or Agora High School, lived. I ended up making friends with a lot of the kids from the complex, and we'd often play basketball together. On weekends, we'd sometimes break into empty apartments and throw parties. One night, I was at a party with a group I didn't know very well, 5 guys and 1 girl. We were smoking, drinking, and at one point, I noticed the guys heading into another room while the girls stayed in the kitchen, drinking a beer. I got up to use the bathroom and overheard one of the guys say, "We're gonna get this girl," and another one saying, "We're going to run a train on her." At the time, I was already a big guy, 6 feet 3 inches and around 250 pounds. When I heard what they were planning to do, I immediately walked into the room and said, "You guys aren't going to do anything like that while I'm around." They tried to convince me to join in, saying it would be fun and she might even enjoy it. I left the room, went back to the girl, and told her she should probably head home because the party was over. She left, and I followed soon after. I never had anything to do with those guys again. But later on, I found out from a mutual friend that the guy who had said, "Let's run a train on her," had actually murdered his girlfriend in college and was later killed in a police chase after crashing his car in the median. The world can be a scary place, especially for women, and it makes me think about it even more now that I have my own daughter. This happened years ago when I first moved to a new town for school. I lived with my second aunt for the first couple of months, but we had very different lifestyles, and I decided it would be better for me to move out. I didn't have much money, so I was hoping to find someone to share the rent with. But after a week, I still hadn't found anyone. One day, I had 2 appointments in the same area, one at 7 p.m. and the other at 8 p.m. on the opposite end of town. It wasn't the cheapest district, but the area seemed decent. My mom was against me going alone and so late, but I didn't really have a choice. I arrived at the metro station early because I had to walk about 15 minutes to get to the first apartment complex. The road to the complex was dark, lined with shabby buildings, and almost completely deserted. Definitely not what I expected from the area at all. Out of nowhere, a guy approached me. He looked about my age, tall, wearing glasses, and had a nerdy, intelligent appearance. He suddenly said that I must be a domestic violence victim and needed help. I was so shocked that I didn't know how to respond. He insisted that he could help, claiming he had all the resources I needed and that I shouldn't be afraid to talk to him. Finally, I managed to regain my voice and told him firmly that I wasn't experiencing any domestic violence and didn't need any help. But he persisted, telling me I shouldn't be afraid of my husband and that there were shelters I could stay in. He introduced himself as a psychologist who worked with women like me. He asked if my husband beat me or verbally assaulted me, and said that if I wanted, he could involve social workers and I'd never have to see him again. I was stunned. I hadn't even had a boyfriend at the time, let alone a husband. This went on for about 5 to 7 minutes. I kept walking, and he kept talking. No matter how many times I told him I didn't need help, he encouraged me to open up and not be afraid to admit I needed rescue from my abusive husband. There was no way I could explain to him that I didn't even have a husband. He seemed completely convinced that I was a domestic violence victim. For a moment, I considered yelling at him, but he was so polite and well-spoken, and honestly, his words sounded like something my mom would say. She works with DV victims, and I'm familiar with the techniques he was using. He didn't seem threatening, and I wasn't scared by him, just confused by the situation. It was so bizarre and out of place that all I wanted was for him to leave me alone. But as I walked on, I couldn't help but wonder if he would follow me all the way to the apartment complex. And if he did, what would happen if he mistook my potential landlord, who was already waiting for me on the porch, for my abusive husband? Thankfully, the guy left earlier. As a last attempt, he tried to give me his business card, but I firmly denied it again, and finally, he walked away. I made my way to the apartment, but long story short, I didn't like it. It was too expensive for what it offered, plus I couldn't shake the feeling that the weird guy most likely lived nearby, which added to the discomfort. The second appointment was 20 minutes from there, and I liked the neighborhood much more. It was well lit, felt safer, and there were lots of shops and people walking by. I arrived 30 minutes early and decided to walk around and check out the porch where I was supposed to meet the girl. Then, I had the second encounter. A guy and a girl exited the porch. When I briefly met the guy's eyes, he stopped completely, staring at me with what seemed like awe, though I'm not sure how to describe it. I thought maybe he recognized me from somewhere, but that seemed unlikely since I didn't know anyone in the city except my aunt and classmates, and he wasn't any of them. I had never met him before. I made sure I was at the right porch, texted the girl I was supposed to meet, and she replied that she was running late. I started walking around the courtyard, but I still had the feeling that the guy's eyes were on me. He was standing nearby, talking to the girl he had exited the porch with. His head slightly moved as I moved across the courtyard. Eventually, I grew tired of the feeling that I was being watched, so I decided to test if he was really following me everywhere. I waited for a moment when he wasn't looking at me and quickly ran behind the building, hiding in a bush. A minute later, I saw him come around the building as well. He looked around, but he couldn't find me. Then, he did something that sent chills down my spine. He stood on his tiptoes, slowly moving his head from side to side, trying to spot me. I heard him muttering, "Where is she?" Goosebumps spread all over my body. After a moment, he left. I stayed behind, waiting for the girl because I didn't want to risk her leaving a bad review for me on the site we were using. When we finally met, she mentioned that she had forgotten the keys and that we need to wait for our flatmate. We sat on a bench chatting for about 30 minutes before we walked to the building. When we arrived, there was the guy again, still standing on the porch with the girl. This time, I saw his eyes practically burning a hole in me. He smiled, or rather, grinned widely, and there was something almost evil about it. His expression was something I'll never forget, because I've never seen anything quite like it before. We walked past him, and my potential flatmate showed me the apartment. By that point, though, I had already made up my mind that we weren't going to live together. It was a pity, because I really liked the place, but with that guy still on the porch, it seemed too likely that he lived there too. Honestly, I don't remember much about the apartment itself. It's been years. Something tells me I might have asked the girls who lived there about the guy, but I don't think their response was anything of consequence. They either brushed it off, and I chose not to push it, or I never asked them at all. I don't recall if I saw him again while I was leaving the building, but I do know that nobody followed me to the metro station. I never saw that guy again after that night. I still don't know what his deal was, and I'm not sure I want to. I never went back to that area, and I don't plan to. It was a weird experience, 2 eerie and unsettling encounters in one night. I'm not sure if I was being set up, or if something else was going on, or if it was just a bizarre coincidence, but something about that day tells me there was a plan in motion. Multiple people might have been involved, and my ability to get away at just the right time might have saved me from something I still can't figure out. What that something was, I'll never know. Thanks for watching. If these stories kept you on edge, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next chilling tale. See you in the next video.